Good afternoon and welcome to the Alberta Land Institute Research Showcase. My name is Eran Kaplinski and I'm the Research Director for ALI. With me today is ALI Director Dave Poulton and the ALI team, including Hannah and Kevin, who will help me to moderate the discussion. If this is your first ALI event, we are an independent research institute based at the University of Alberta, and we are committed to promoting, advancing research in the service of better land use and land management in the province and beyond. Please visit our website to learn more about our work. We are broadcasting to you today from Treaty 6 territory. The University of Alberta respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First People of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Our purpose today is to showcase 3 recent cutting-edge projects conducted by 3 of our excellent research partners and their teams. We are very proud to have supported this work. First, we will have Dr. Kristoff van Assche, Professor in Planning, Governance and Development, who will discuss land use tools as part of a long-term strategy for local development. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kristoff.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Well, so I'm Kristoff van Assche, but as you see, I'm not alone here. This is Dr. Monica Grutzmacher, my wife and colleague, and she was also very involved in this project. I would like to thank the Institute, of course, for not just for inviting us today, but also for the support over several years. We very much appreciate, of course. There's also another slightly different summary of the project, but not contradictory, of course, on the website of the Land Institute. For today, we would like to focus a little more on the question of fragmentation and strategy for overcoming fragmentation, and of course, the role of land use tools in all of that. So, as a very broad introduction, we would like to remind ourselves too that, of course, the way land is organized is revealing a lot about a community, about what is thinking about itself, how it looks at itself, how it understands its environment, how it understands its future, and if there were problems and conflicts in the history of the community, this also tends to be visible in the landscape itself, of course. When there's communities with a difficult history, and I do want to start with that, when there's communities that experience the shock or several shocks, serious ups and downs, serious problems, even sometimes existential crisis, and this is very common in rural communities across Canada, and I would say in many other countries, there's a few stories that we often hear. And one is the story of resilience, meaning that the answer has to be some kind of bouncing back to a previous state. And we would say here, of course, that is great if it works, but we should best consider that as one category of strategy. It's not always possible. We have to understand whether it is possible in a particular place. Then there's adaptation, another category of strategies where the community changes, adapting to certain opportunities and certain threats as well. There's a possibility of collapse. And again, this also happens a lot in rural communities across the world. And there's also another path, and that is of complete self-transformation, really changing the identity and the activities of the community, and that we call reinvention. So we wanted to start with that just to show that we're open to many different possibilities of transition. Now, another issue that we often observe in many rural communities and resource communities in Alberta, in the rest of Canada, in many other parts of the world, is what we call the concentration problem. Now, what is that? Well, we refer to a situation where community has been dependent on one activity, one resource for a long time, and the governance system has been simplified, gradually simplified. You could also say specialized in a more positive expression, but it has been simplified over the years, over generations maybe. There's fewer actors involved, there's fewer institutions or tools of coordination between the actors involved, can be plans, policies, laws. And there's also fewer sorts of knowledge, local knowledge and expertise involved. So the result of that is that it becomes harder and harder to envision a different future and a different path right now. Now, to stay in the very uplifting atmosphere here, in some cases, definitely not always, but we have to mention that in some cases, there is something that we could call trauma or community trauma or collective trauma. And we can see that also, we can observe that when communities tend to repeat their ideas, their practices over and over again, when reflection on the assumption and on those practices becomes very, very difficult. And then also in such case, it's very hard to envision a different future from what is happening now, or a different future from an idealized past. Now, one idea, and that comes from psychoanalysis, one idea that we think is quite important here is that legacy is not the same as memory. So the way that a community understands its past, what it remembers, that's one thing, and that can be structured by all kinds of problems, but also, of course, very good events in the history of the community. But when there is a trauma, when there is a shock that leaves a trauma, that can be visible in many other things. Besides the way that the past is remembered, it can also be visible, for example, in the way things are organized, in the types of documents that are used and not used, and so forth. So understanding the different legacies of a shock, of trauma, remembering differently then can help to do that. Now, we operate on the basis of a few assumptions, or we subscribe to a few assumptions here. And we're coming now to land use again, and we're coming to strategy again. One important idea, in our view, is that land use policies are often disconnected from broader strategies and disconnected from other land use policies, and that this makes it very difficult to envision and to steer the community in another directions. Now, we need, therefore, and this is another assumption, we need a strategy. Communities do need a strategy that can have many forms and shapes. It does not have to be a comprehensive plan, but the land use tools, whatever land use tools are in use, have to be ideally embedded in that. If it is not connected to a broader strategy, then it will be very difficult for the land use tool to achieve its goal, and it will be more difficult for the broader strategy, if it exists, to be actually implemented. Now, this ideally happens, and we would say it should happen, without ignoring the informal institutions, the informal coordination mechanisms, but also without ignoring the stories about the community in the community itself. Many strategies, many documents that are intended to guide the community in a certain direction are produced by experts, outside experts maybe, or they are produced by people who know the community very well, but still without too much participation and engagement. And that makes it more difficult than in the long run for a strategy to be persuasive. That also means, if we start from those assumptions, that we're asking questions like what would happen if there is no strategy? What would happen if the land use tools are disconnected from strategy? What happens if the land use tools are disconnected from each other? Our observations here come from communities in Alberta, but we're also leaning on observations in other parts of the world, including in the US. We used interviews, semi-structured and structured surveys, analysis of policy documents and plans and maps, old and new maps, and also collection of data, descriptive statistics. And we also, of course, try to visit communities. Our perspective on communities and on communities moving forward and adapting maybe better to their environment, that perspective also borrows from social ecological systems thinking. And here we would say that connection works ideally through governance, meaning the connection between social and ecological systems, but it's never perfectly coordinated, meaning that the way a community is using its resources, the way it's using the land, works through governance in coordinated action, as you see here. But there's always a remainder of non-coordinated action. Now, this is true even in the most well-functioning community. This would be true even in a place that is really achieving what it wants to achieve. In most places, there could be more coordination of collective action. There could be more coordination in strategy to move in a desired direction. And those situations, of course, we're dealing with and we're trying to analyze. Still here, part of our theoretical perspective, when we look at governance, we look at things also beyond local government. Governance, in our view, is the taking of collectively binding decisions by actors. Some of those actors are governmental actors, others are non-governmental. Actors can be individuals, groups, or organizations. We cannot define that in advance. We cannot map the stakeholders without knowing the community, who the stakeholders would be and who the actors would be. That has to come out of an analysis. And each community develops in a unique manner in this way. Each community develops its own configuration of governance and its own path of governance. And that path always leaves some space for change through steering. And there's always rigidities. There's always things that are harder to change. When we speak of community and the governance of community is always more than just a group of people. It's also more than the local government, as I mentioned, that is then supposed to represent. Of course, that is happening, but it's always more. And there's informal institutions and there's narratives. A community, in the end, only exists if there are people who believe that they're part of a community. So that means it is a story. It's a narrative. Doesn't mean it is fiction, doesn't mean it is fake. It is very real because people give meaning to their lives and to their communities by means of narrative. Now, strategy. What is strategy and why talk about strategy? Well, strategy is broader than planning. Strategy can take different forms. It can take the form of a plan for the long term, a very comprehensive plan. But there's a number of other documents that could also take on that function or take on that role of moving the community in a particular direction. Now, I mentioned strategy, I mentioned narrative. Well, for us, a strategy also has to be a narrative. If a strategy is just a collection of different policies or a way of coordinating other policies, if it is only that, then it's probably not going to be very persuasive for people in the community itself. And of course, those narratives are not easy to change. Sometimes they can be deeply entrenched. Sometimes those narratives can be problematic. Sometimes they can be very powerful in a positive sense. And key narratives, of course, are identity narratives. If there's a very strong story, we are like this, well, then there's also a very good chance that people will think, okay, so the future has to be like that. And it doesn't even, it's a waste of our time. We shouldn't even try to move in a different direction. Also, that would be like betraying ourselves. Now, strategy is therefore an institution in itself. It's a tool of coordination. between other institutions. It's a collection of other institutions. It cannot work by itself. It has to regulate the use, coordinate the use of other plans, policies, tools, informal institutions maybe. And it is a narrative. Now, another function that a strategy at community level probably should have is that of coordinating policy domains. If there is a comprehensive plan, and that is intended as the main strategic document, and if that plan only coordinates other plans, then it's going to be very difficult. If there is an idea, this is the future that we want as community, and this is the way we want to get there, if we have a strategy like that, then in all likelihood, we will have to coordinate policy domains, water management, ecology, public works, economic development, land use planning in a new way. Of course, this will be a matter of competition too, because the people that make the strategy might believe that they can coordinate all the others, but that doesn't mean that the others also want that. One other aspect that is important, and of course also in the Alberta cases showed up as very important, is the material environment, both the natural environment and the human-made environment. Important then for the formulation and the implementation of strategy. Well, think of our climate. That's one aspect of the natural environment. Here, of course, that makes a big difference. Think of oil wells that are orphaned, old infrastructures that can, be a burden right now. But in a positive sense, also think of all the infrastructure that has been created maybe in boom times for oil, and that could be reused, play a role in a different story about the future of the community. So strategy. We're making an argument for strategy at the community level, a strategy that can take many paths and many forms. Now here, we're repeating an argument that we made already in the beginning of this presentation, and that is that land use is essential. And of course, everybody here in the audience, and certainly at the Land Use Institute, would agree with that. But if we have a strategy about the future of the community, and there is no connection with the way that we organize the land, well, then it's most likely not going to work. There are very few community strategies that would not touch upon the use of the land and the way that is organized. That can be through planning, that can be through all kinds of other tools. And when we speak of land use tools, they can be zoning tools, but thus they can also come from wetland policies, for example, infrastructural policies and so forth. All those things can fall under land use. They ideally would have to be integrated, at least coordinated in a broader strategy. Now, we talk about coordination all the time. Strategy as coordination, that means that, a natural enemy would be fragmentation. Fragmentation makes it difficult to coordinate. If there's a fragmentation of policy domains, there's a history of not coordinating those. If there is also a disconnect between different categories of land use tools, for example, between the zoning plan and the comprehensive plan or development plan, well, then it will be very difficult to overcome that. So the more fragmentation you have there, fragmentation between domains of policies, between tools, between spaces also that are not coordinated, that ask for more strategy, while at the same time, it makes it more difficult to introduce strategy. Now, one very basic thing, but that often does not happen, one very basic thing that we argue for here is the mapping of this fragmentation and coordination. What is coordinated in local governance, so broader than local government, and what is not coordinated? Which policy domains are very isolated from each other while they should not be? Which types of documents that affect the use of the land, the coordination of the use of the land, are coordinated, that can be informally too, and which ones are not? Now, there's a few ways to increase fragmentation. So there's a few common ways to make strategizing more difficult. And I think most of you are also familiar with those. Often this happens not on purpose at all, it just takes place. One of those ways to move away from strategy, to move towards fragmentation, is not updating policies, plans that have to do with land use, with the use of other resources also. Another way is ignore in decision-making in local governance tools that are there. They will become rusty, they will lose trust, they will lose their teeth over time if they're not used. Another way to move away from strategy, to move towards fragmentation, is to use exceptions all the time, to use exceptions as a routine. And that can be variances in the case of land use planning, but this could be also in other types of regulation and policy where then exceptions are accepted. So another way, again, to move in that wrong direction, in our view, is not to use strategy documents that are there, or not coordinating strategy documents that are there. We would argue that it's better to get rid of them than leave them there. Because if they're there, they will create confusion, they will not be useful, they can be used against you as community over time. So if there are unused and not connected or coordinated strategic documents, we would say better to replace them, better to get rid of them than leave them on the shelf forever. And of course, another very obvious way to move in this wrong direction, in our view, would be just not talking. Decision makers, this can be informal as well, not talking to each other, politicians not talking to the bureaucracy or the civil servants in different departments, not talking to each other, and so forth. Ad hoc responses, even when there's a feeling of urgency, can be extremely problematic over the long term, of course. And many short-term reactions, that seemed reasonable, we have to survive, we have to do this, in hindsight, were not so urgent, were not so reasonable, and in fact undermine the long-term stability and maybe even viability of the community. Now this here, again, very cheerful with the little skulls there, refers to such a situation where there's strategy documents that are effective in coordinating actors, in coordinating other institutions, and strategy documents that are ineffective. There's always, and we heard that in all the Alberta communities that we looked at, that we visited and studied, there's always documents that pretend to be strategic or that worked for a while in coordinating action, moving in a certain direction, then not anymore. So those we call ineffective. Now, some of those are ineffective because they're linked to, they're coordinated with other documents that are ineffective and that are not trusted and so forth. On the other hand, in many, many cases, there's also strategy documents that do have a positive impact. They might not be able to steer the community by themselves in a desired direction, but they do have a coordinative effect. And we argue, and we observe that too, that this often has something to do with the fact that they are linked to informal institutions, informal rules, traditions, narratives, identity stories in the community itself, and that they're linked to each other. That can also reinforce them and increase their positive effect or coordinative effect. There's always some contradictions, of course, also between the effective strategy documents and the beliefs, narratives, informal institutions in the community. And that is not necessarily a bad thing, because, of course, in policy, in governance, sometimes it is necessary to take a distance from certain beliefs that are still lingering, while in other cases, we decide as a community to build on that, maybe try to turn informal rules into formal rules, and so forth. So, still, important to know which strategy documents there are, which land use tools there are, whether they contradict each other or not, whether they are embedded in each other or not, whether they function as a whole in coordinating action, steering the community in a particular direction. Now, the narratives will always be important, we argue. The narratives in the community will change over time as well. So a strategy will have to be adaptive, and a strategy always has to deal with competing stories within the community on how to deal with itself. Of course, this is the domain of politics, where politicians always really are elected because of one story about the community. Another politician is elected because of another story. Within the administration, there might be 3, 4, 5 other narratives about what the community is and what it should do. So a process of visioning, in our view, is always important there and probably has to recur on an ongoing basis. This is not necessarily, not in every case, visioning for the production of a new formal strategy, but a thinking about how to combine different narratives into one that could be the basis of a strategy. This has to be an iterative process. In some communities, this happens in a very natural way already, where local administration, local politics, business people, landowners have different ways of meeting on a regular basis, thinking, is this still the way we want to go there? Aren't there other opportunities? Shouldn't we integrate, a different possible future into our strategy? Now, this vision, as in the kind of synthesis story that then could be the basis of strategy, cannot be whatever. It needs to be also grounded in reality, of course. As one Newfoundland politician told us, a fantasy is not a vision. Of course, nobody can predict the future, and we can steer to a certain extent the community in a particular direction. But we also know that not every future is as likely as others. Now, even if it is realistic, even if, insider experts and outsider experts would say, okay, this vision is realistic, that still doesn't mean that it's going to gain traction, of course, because it still needs to be persuasive locally in order to have a coordinative effect locally. And in order to be persuasive, we come back here to our idea of informal institutions, narratives, where the forging of a vision, of a unifying narrative, has to be sensitive for, of course, what people actually believe and what they want, even if outside experts have a completely different idea there. So the strategy will have to be adaptive, because some of the institutions, some of the tools of coordination, policies, plans, laws, will lose their traction, will lose their teeth over time, because narratives change over time, because trust can, move in different directions. We trust that this future is more achievable and not so much this other one. So the strategy will have to be adaptive. And adaptive is something very different from having no strategy. Having a long-term perspective and an idea of how to get there that is changing on a regular basis, very different from not having that. Now, in some cases, it might not be possible for some communities, it might not be possible to articulate from the point that they're in, to articulate a strategy as in narrative, an institution, and there might be some detours needed. In some case, there is not the capacity to even do that. In some cases, there might be intractable conflict that makes it very difficult. In some cases, it might be resources that are missing. We would say that, this path that we recommend from self-analysis, including the mapping of the fragmentation to visioning to strategy, ideally that works. In a number of cases, we need detours where sometimes we have to work first on developing a particular asset. We don't know exactly about our future yet, but we do know we need to fix the road first. We don't know exactly how to diversify our economy, but we do know that we want to clean up the pollution that came from this or that type of resource extraction. Okay, we think we want to do something with tourism, but it seems that before trying to give a detailed vision there, we need to work on, strengthening our administration, maybe bringing in a planner, maybe bringing in a tourism specialist, finding money for that, and so forth and so forth. In some cases, that would mean we need a form of transitional governance, that for a certain while we focus on certain topics, and after that we can move to the more articulation of the strategy itself. So the key word, strategy. Communities, in our view, do need a strategy. The community, of course, every community is different. Every governance system, how they take collectively binding decisions is different. The type of policies, plans, laws they use for that will be different, but land use and the tools to organize the land will have to play a role in a community strategy. Now, a very basic thing to keep in mind there, repeating myself already, is that we should not look at strategy always as one formal document that can coordinate all the others. We have to think as community and as outsiders, academics like us, we have to really look what works strategically. And that can be partly some of the documents that pretend to be strategic, others not. This can also be gentlemen's or gentlewomen's agreements that really have a big impact on the coordination of action. Fragmentation there is a big part of the problem. Strategy is hampered by fragmentation, and strategy can help to overcome this fragmentation. In the process of strategizing, I would say policy learning, policy adaptation can slowly be enhanced. Observation, self-observation, self-analysis in the community, by the community, in our view, is the most essential thing here. Observations coming from outsiders, experts, higher-level politicians, all, of course, can be valuable, but most important for the future of a community is cultivating that self-observation, trying to look at ourselves and our history, the way we take decisions, the way we try to strategize from different angles, and that can then help slowly to synthesize, to overcome fragmentation, and to come up with a strategy with more teeth and with more impact. These are some results also, some published results of the research. Several special issues in journals also came out of the work supported by the Land Institute, and coming soon, and very much based also on the work for the Alberta Land Institute, is this community guide or citizens guide, not an academic work, but really a tool for communities to reflect on themselves. How did we get into this situation? How can we move forward? How can we strategize? How can we overcome fragmentation of the kind that we described here? And of course, I did not do this alone. I will move the focus a little bit more on Monica here again, who can also answer your questions. There were a whole group of students involved. Bob Summers, my colleague, was involved. Leith Deacon, now Guelph, was also involved, and we very much enjoyed the opportunity to do this teamwork. And once again, we would like to thank the Land Institute for their support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristoff. And thank you, Monica. But you've given us a lot of information and a lot to think about. I'd like to return to one of the quotes that you gave early on, which I found beautiful, almost haunting. Legacies are more diverse than memories. Can you say more about that? You've traveled and visited many communities. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And of course, we can both answer. Thank you, Eran. Well, the legacies can, for example, be visible in a landscape that is really simplified, that has focused on one activity for many, many years, can be optimized for that activity. Let's say in agriculture, all the little creeks are gone, the small landscape elements are gone, or in the case of coal mining, dust, pollution, slag heaps, little ruins can dot the landscape. And for many locals, this can be not a problem at all. That they're just used to that. That is not understood necessarily as a legacy of focusing on one activity. In other cases, when there was a real shock, so closer really to the idea of trauma, like in coal mining areas where everything closed, where the mines are closed, but people still see themselves as coal mining communities. Maybe not individuals see themselves as miners, but they see, okay, this is a coal mining community. Again, these legacies of the activity and also the legacies of the trauma can be very diverse. It could, for example, be visible in the presence of only a few stories in local governance. That can be in the city council or the town council. It could also be in the clubs of people, that meet in a certain cafe and that are actually really important for local decision making. And it is also possible there that there is a great trust in people that used to be managers in a company that used to be important. And even if that company has closed and that has scarred the community, at the same time, people rely on advice for either those managers or people that really remind them of those type of managers that used to be important in the good old days. So there's many types of traces of the old activities and also of the shock that came with the closure of the old activities or the bust periods. So there's many traces, and you cannot always find that in the way that they write their own history. Because if you see a history book of a local community, it's often like, okay, there was forestry, there was mining, there was agriculture, family Krajcek came, and then another family came, and they built a boat and so forth. And of course, it can be very interesting and sophisticated. That's not the point. But in the way they write their own history, you cannot really see all the ways that this activity and the closure and the shocks often that came with it have marked the community, the way they take decisions, the way they think about themselves and about their futures. And in the case of the Crow's Nest Pass, well, just the fact that there's such a strong belief, that the future is mining, that there was a backlash after a different local government with different ideas was elected about 10 years ago. And that we then went back to the mining narrative and also the individuals, quite old, that of course want the best for the community, but their idea is then another mine. And again, this is not just something that we would find there. This is something to find in many places, that focused on one activity and then they were scarred by it, often by the closure, or in some cases not even closure, but other types of really shocks that came from that activity. So yeah.
Dave, you could just unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks, Hannah, and thank you, Kristoff and Monica. That is very interesting. I have a different type of question about legacy, I guess, and it is sparked in part by a comment that I saw in the chat with respect to some of the unfulfilled commitments in the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. And without focusing on that particular issue, I think a lot of communities, maybe all of us, have experience with either unfulfilled commitments or planning processes and strategies that have languished or simply failed for whatever reason. And that can, to my mind, give rise to a legacy of cynicism about strategies and processes generally. And I wonder if your research can offer us any guidance as to how we can break out of that syndrome of failure and cynicism and get on a more constructive path.
Well, thank you. We have no simple answers, of course. Nevertheless, a few observations or a few reflections here. Try to be very concise, but you can also. And one would be, maybe obviously, maybe too obviously, reflection on why these things failed. And even before that, maybe even more elementary, looking at the repetitions. Okay, what are we repeating? So, so there's a question. Okay, why did this sustainability plan not work? But there can be even a more elementary question: what kind of things are coming back in our own history of our own governance, our own decision making? And this, again, we have to understand broadly, not just local government, but also other players that have an influence on collectively binding decisions. And often that will go through local government, but not always. So these repetitions, okay, that's already a sign that there's something going on, that we need a different form of self-reflection and self-analysis. Is it that we're forced to do things, we're forced into forms of planning by other authorities, let's say by the province, or we feel forced by outside experts to do certain kind of strategy exercises, or they tell us that we need this kind of, that we need a certain type of plan and that there's promises coming, or we get money from somewhere if we have that type of plan and so forth. So first of all, if we understand then why we're actually doing it, then second, trying to figure out why it would not work, then I would say it's very useful to hit the brake on kind of, I'm sorry, it's not my intention to insult anyone here, but to neurotically reproduce and to repeat, plan making and strategy making, but saying, okay, what is our situation? These things don't work. Are there other forms of coordination at a larger scale that are actually working? And because it is very well possible that there's formal planning processes that are a failure, but they are a failure in a context where informally there might be a very different strategy already for the community. And in those cases, I would say, well, it's really important then to try to link with those processes, even if they're informal, and even if the people in local administration might not like them, because it's also a matter of sometimes clashing ideologies, that there might be certain formal strategy processes, but many in the community don't like the general idea of a formal strategy at all, or they don't like it to take the form of a comprehensive plan that is going to tell us exactly what to do. So what would also be helpful there is then broadening the idea of possible strategies, not just the content of many different forms that it could take. So I don't want to take too long with my answer. And
I would just like to add, Dave, thank you for the question. We have received that question many times, the same. So it's something that comes up time and time again. And unfortunately, we feel a little bit like disappointing people with our answer, because what we see that is happening very, very often, and the reason why, that just to add to what Kristof said, the reason why these things keep happening and failure keeps occurring is that often here and everywhere, there's a very strong tendency to follow blueprint solutions, and recipes. And that is often what we see happening everywhere. So to develop a strategy, follow this scheme: first step, second step, third step. But that might work one time in 1,000. But each community is different and each path is different. The way that the community has decided to organize collective decision-making will be different for each community. The players, the actors, the institutions, the relationships between them is differently in each case. And unfortunately, that takes us then to the self-reflection stage, where, of course, you can also ask for outsider help for starting that, or to kind of to jumpstart that process. But it is unavoidable to get out of these kind of loops. It is necessary to start with a deep reflection. That is not, of course, easy, especially when we're talking about scars that are deeply embedded in the community.
And connected to that, I think that was very valuable. These recipes or blueprint solutions that Monica talked about, often they come from, and I don't want to upset people here again, from consultants. And you cannot blame personally consultants because they have to do their job, they have to make money. They were successful in one community. And again, this is not just Alberta. I've seen the same thing all over Europe as well. Say, we know how to do your sustainability planning, you know, and you don't need to have anyone in the house. We're cheaper, we're faster, we're more efficient, we're private sector. So it links to that ideology that private sector is always better. So just hire us and we'll tell you how to do it. But of course, that is very difficult. Or another example, linking to what Monica said, if a provincial government said, okay, local sustainability planning for rural areas, that has to be the place for your local strategy. Now, in theory, yeah, that could work because everything is sustainability. But then in practice, the way that relates, like Monica was saying, to the unique character of local governance and what they want to strategize and what tools they want to use and how formal they want that to be, that will be completely different. So you can already predict that the function of that local sustainability plan, what that's going to do is going to be different everywhere. And in many cases, it will be just a paper exercise. In other cases, it can be brilliant. Yeah. Okay, sorry, this was way too long. Apologies.
I can ask one quick question. One thing I was wondering is, you talked about some of the factors that make it more difficult to create strategy or to strategize in communities. But I was wondering if you found any factors that enable community strategy in Alberta communities.
Well, yes, for sure, and it's often also just the flip side of the obstacles. One would be if local governance is strong, and of course, I know that is a vague idea, but then it's also not a vague idea, because it just means if in the community there is a tradition of collective decision making through city council, through other arenas, could be also Chamber of Commerce, other places, downtown association, and so forth. And if there is a tradition there of coordinating action and achieving something. Another thing is the presence of strategy makes adaptation of strategy easier. If there's nothing, that makes it more difficult. Then another one would be, and this is linking to a previous question, if there's no cynicism about strategies for the long term, also about planning, that helps for sure. If there's some shared belief in that, even if everybody disagrees on the direction that it takes, if there is a basic agreement that, okay, it does make sense to think as a community about our long term, and we also have an idea of the types of tools, policies, plans, laws that could be useful for that, that is great. Another enabling factor would be just capacity in the local administration. Even if you have very talented, very active local entrepreneurs who are also in local government and they're also in the Chamber of Commerce, and they feel they do a great job. Maybe they do. Point is not to criticize that, but it's still very useful also to work slowly to building up an administration that can navigate all the signals that are coming from the provincial level, but also that can see, some of the opportunities for economic diversification, that can also navigate the bureaucratic maze at the higher levels. And of course, there's always a risk to that, but I understand, very basic, but this administrative capacity there is absolutely helpful. Another thing that is always positive, again, maybe sounds very obvious, is the presence of really diverse perspectives and forms of knowledge in local governance, with a tradition of discussing that, but at the same time, not a polarization in two sides, where then everything is transformed into a black and white discussion, because then we know, okay, maybe one group wins, then the next one, Then we go back and forth and it's very difficult.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just to add to that point in the presentation, Kristof mentioned social ecological systems, and that is basically kind of making reference to this point of diversity. Yeah? And what we are talking about is complex systems here. Yeah, communities are complex systems. They involve a whole realm of the social and the ecological interacting, very much so, or more obviously so, rural communities. And so when you ask about some enabling factors, when we have to make reference to these social ecological systems that are complex, are unpredictable by definition. We cannot predict, we cannot predict even the weather, really. Yeah, and we know that it's a complex system. So we have to think that they're unpredictable, that a change in one part of the system has a whole series of changes that we cannot tell, we cannot predict, we cannot manage. And it will be the same change in another part of the system can have a cascade of different responses. Yeah. So basically, the question is, and also making reference to the fact that these are also systems that are in constant evolution. So whatever we might find as an asset today that can help us strategize might not do so in the future. But the other side of the story is also true. What we see as something that is not relevant at all today might be essential for our future. And so and they're linking to the point of diversity. Yeah, is just as in an ecosystem. Diverse ecosystems have that capacity, that asset of reacting to disturbance and change because they have different kind of sources to grab onto. Yeah, so the more diverse the realm of the social and the ecological, the more you harness diversity of thought, the more you harness diversity, institutional diversity, and so forth. It is probably likely that you are stronger in reacting to change and to being able to craft a strategy in the future. So again, long answer there.
Thanks very much. Monica and Kristof, that was a wonderful way to start the afternoon, and we thank you for a very rich presentation. And we'll see you again soon.